Hi, I'm Eric Sonnenschein. I'm an author, writer, essayist, novelist, poet, journalist. My most recent book is Rocked and Rolled. It's about the rock and roll scene in the late 70s, early 80s in downtown New York. You can find me at ericsonnenschein.com on LinkedIn, Facebook. Available on amazon.com. And you're watching and listening at Two Geeks Talking.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Two Geeks Talking is an entertainment industry interview show where we interview the creative people from the comic, film, TV, movie, and video game industries. And of course, I'm your host, Kurt Sasso. We are joined today by a multi-talented individual. This is his first time on the show. He is an author, a writer, a journalist, a columnist, a poet. He has also played in a band in the 70s in New York. He has also joined the Peace Corps. We have a lot to talk about here today. We are joined by the ever-talented Eric J. Sonnenschein.
I'm fine, thanks. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I love authors only because they have so much to say, so much to do. And you are not only talking about the rock and roll scene, you're talking about other areas you're very passionate about here. You joined the Peace Corps as well, too. Like, we have so much to dive into here today. It's going to be a fun conversation. But for those that don't know anything about yourself as a creative person, tell us who you are and what you're bringing to Two Geeks Talking today.
Well, Kurt, you presciently, you just said that writers are generally people who have a lot to talk about. I have to say that as a writer, I'm also somebody who's all my writing is fed by my experience. I know that there are writers, who research their subjects, and that's perfectly fine. I mean, they'll go to a library, they'll get inspired by a figure or an event or a time period, and they'll research it and then, populate their books with characters that they basically imagine from the stuff of research. But for me, the research is all first person, singular, out there in the field. Now, that's not to say that for instance, I got into rock and roll so that I could write a book about it. Got into the Peace Corps so that I could write a book about it. Although I will say that, the late Norman Mailer was perfectly unabashed about saying that when World War II broke out, he was wondering which theater of conflict would be the best one to write a novel about. He thought it would be Europe, but unfortunately for him, he got assigned to the Pacific Theater. Of course, he wrote a book about it. I wouldn't say that I wrote about the Peace Corps. I intended to write about it before I got in. I won't say that I intended to write about rock and roll before I got involved, or I got into advertising so that I could write a book about it. That's just kind of what happened. I will say this, though. People have asked me like about rock and roll because it's often considered to be a peak experience. I mean, everybody wants to be a rock star, the drugs, sex, and rock and roll. But you know what I often say? I got into rock and roll because I wanted to sing and to get my music out there and to share my lyrics and all the rest of that. This is not a rock and roll memoir. It's not like me talking about the peak experience of my life and being very nostalgic about it. Not at all. As a matter of fact, I often think that I was in rock and roll in the end so that I could write this novel because the novel, writing it was so interesting to me and I enjoyed doing it so much. I felt like I was, I don't know, the materials, everything sort of came together for me and I had so many insights from writing it. I should say something about Rocked and Rolled since that's my most recent book. Basically, it's a comic historical novel set in the late 70s, early 80s, downtown New York, new wave rock and roll scene. It depicts a cityscape and an environment and a whole population that no longer really exist. I mean, if you go to downtown New York, to the East Village, for instance, and you look for some of the places, a lot of the places that pop up in this novel, you won't see them because they're gone. The Kiev, the diner where the protagonist spends so much of his time, that's gone. All of these the clubs, Max's Kansas City, CBGB's, all of them, they're all gone. And even the sense of the street scene, St. Mark's Place, the people that you would see milling about there, they're all completely different. I mean, it's kind of unusual for me to say this. I mean, Houston Street, which used to be a derelict city, like lots of empty lots, lots of trash and vagrants and, lots of detritus from drug use. All gone. Now you have skyscrapers with awnings and doormen and all the accoutrements of gentrified living. So that's a part of what the book is about. But it's also a little bit about the Horatio Alger American dream kind of turned on its head a bit. It follows the exploits, the disappointments, the triumphs, and basically the quest of a young man who's trying to get into the very competitive music business. At that time, in the late 70s, early 80s, there were literally 500 bands in New York, all trying to get a few coveted gigs at some of the great good clubs and also to get on a record label. So you have this situation. He's not particularly equipped to be a rock and roller in that he didn't start out like Michael McDonald, for instance, as an 11-year-old playing for his friends' parties and then going on to playing college fraternities and everything. He didn't start out young. For rock and roll, starting out in your 20s, you might as well be starting out in midlife because a lot of the people have already, had a lot of experience. This character, Trevor, is trying to reinvent himself in his 20s, get a band together, do all of those things. And this book, Rocked and Rolled, is kind of about him, his quest, the funky people he meets, the eccentric people he meets along the way who are also trying to reinvent themselves. It's also kind of an exploration, kind of meditation, if you will. It's very active and very action filled. It's a meditation on why make music. It's so tough. It's so hard. There's so many obstacles. There's so much resistance. There's so many pitfalls along the way. Why do people even bother? And in a larger sense, why do they bother? Why do we bother to be creative? Is it just something intrinsic to us that we can't pluck out of ourselves? Or is there something else going on here? And so this is what Rocked and Rolled is all about. But it's also because, as I said before, Trevor is a guy who has to sort of like look at the back of the soup can and follow the directions. He has to kind of create all of this on the fly as he's going along. A how-to book on how to get your rock and roll band together, how to invent yourself as a rock and roll singer. I often say, Moby Dick. If somebody asks me, where do I go to find out about whales? I wouldn't tell them to go and read some zoology book about whales. I tell them to look at Moby Dick. Moby Dick is obviously a novel, right? It's about fictional characters, but you learn more about whales by reading Herman Melville than you would about almost by anyone else. He'll tell you the history, the mythology, the anatomy, the physiology of whales. And so, in a way, Rocked and Rolled is kind of like the anatomy of becoming a rock and roll singer, a rock and roll performer, and a performer just in general. There is a very big anomaly about this book, too, though. I'm a kind of guy I've always looked at mythology. I'm fascinated by mythology, and I always have been. But I'm also the kind of person who's a little bit of a muckraker. I like to explore myths, a little bit like Leonardo cutting open the cadaver so you can see how all the muscles and the organs are situated and how they work. Everybody thinks of rock and roll as drugs, sex, and rock and roll, the sinful trinity of the music business. But the thing is, I have here deliberately a character. He doesn't want it. He's not interested in all of the perks of being a rock and roll singer. He's not interested in the drugs. He's not interested in shooting up. He's not interested in all the groupies and all the others. He is literally on a quest for meaning. I mean, it seems weird, because rock and roll is often, it's not considered the holy grail. It's not considered the search for a cure for cancer or anything like that. And yet, for this character, Trevor, he will find meaning by getting his songs out there, by having the most people listen to what he has to say. He wants to, in a sense, make himself, his life significant through performing. And I think that maybe that's why the book has resonated with a lot of people. I think women, men, anyone, even if you don't even like rock and roll or know much about it, I think that they find something here that transcends just that specific topic because it's really just about making yourself visible, making yourself audible in a world where it's just so easy to just sort of pass through like one of the silent people, through the turnstiles, down the freeway, wherever it is, make no mark at all and be completely undistinguished. And so that's what it's about.
But it also sounds like, and New York seems to be the place where you can go from anywhere in the world and reinvent yourself. The fact that you're doing that through your character, even though you've already experienced that yourself, is rather interesting in that respect. So then, as a person that has been in a rock and roll band, that has been on the scene, so to speak, and has also written this book, among many others, how have you reinvented yourself?
Oh, that's a really great question. I would say that I have had to reinvent myself many times, some of it by choice, some of it by necessity. Although some people would say it's always necessity because character is destiny. We are compelled by who we are and by the experiences we've had and by the aspirations that we possess to do the things we do. But for instance, I would say we're born by our mothers. We're born, through either through the birth canal or cesarean or whatever. That's the first birth. But I would say we're also born many times after that. I was reborn when I got into, I mean, I was always on a course of being a intellectual. I studied hard. I used to pore over vocabulary lists so I do well on the SATs. I went to good college and I went into the Peace Corps and I wanted to be literary, but then I got into music. When I got into music in New York, I also became a cab driver. So that opened up a whole new area for me being the man of the street, the more tough guy, getting into car confrontations and all the rest of it. Then I became a teacher. I became an instructor. I had to adopt a different code. I had to become a responsible person, a person who's a leader of people younger than myself. That sort of ended up in a cul-de-sac financially. I had a family, so I got into advertising, and that opened up a whole new area for me. When I met my wife, in a way, I always say my mother was my first mother. My wife was a second birth. She kind of like introduced me to another kind of living, more of a, responsible, committed, something that was on the way to being a person who had a family. And then, of course, having a daughter, I had to become a parent. I had to make sure that there were diapers, the diaper station, and that we took her to the pediatrician and all the rest of that. And then, of course, doing the homework, getting her into schools. So I would say that I have had to reinvent myself, but I don't know if it's reinvention or it's more like the reason the serpent had such powerful mythological significance to humans was because we could see the manifestation of what we understood in ourselves, which is the shedding of a skin. It's not immortality, but within a lifetime, we do go through vicissitudes. We go through different incarnations, if you will. And the person I am now who can talk to you seems a relatively level-headed, blah, blah, blah. That's not always the person I was. And sometimes though that those older incarnations will come out of a person. You'll see me become, a gibberish spewing, immature, whatever. But the reality is that we do go through the changes. There doesn't seem to be any way around it.
Has your love of music, has your love of what you've done throughout your life helped inform your writing in some way, shape, or form?
Yes, I would say absolutely. Music was integral to writing. My many experiences have always fed my writing. I believe that writing is, in a way, I was just thinking about this because I'm writing about a thing called the moment. What does it mean to miss your moment or to have your moment? And the idea that we have one thing, one pinnacle, one zenith, one moment of truth, and then everything else is a footnote, to me, that just seems wrong. But of course, I wrote an 11-page essay on one thing, the moment. The moment would seem to be a second, and I've written all this about it. And I realized that writing art is a kind of way that we emulate the oyster. I don't think I'm the first to think about this, but it is something that I believe that we have something that bothers us, that irritates us, and we're constantly trying to deal with it. And the dealing with it, the words, the colors, the sounds, all of the things that we put together, the art is our pearl. It's how we process and then in some sense beautify or make acceptable the things that obviously the dilemmas, the agitations, the injustices, whatever it is. It's the thing that we can't quite just walk away from or that we can't just dismiss. And that's how we make our art. In a way, thinking is a way of chiseling away at the myth, at the lie, chiseling away at it until it's not there anymore, until you've made some sense of it or found the truth in it. But it's also a way of coding it. It's also a way of embellishing and a little bit of how we resolve our cognitive dissonance with the horrors and the discomforts we have to go through. Cognitive dissonance, things that just don't square with us, that we're just never going to be able to abide. And yet we have to abide them. And art is one of the ways we can do it. It's our consolation. Freud said that only three ways we can deal with discontent as humans, as organisms. One of them is drugs, work, and art.
So, how was the birth of creativity formed?
I would say that humans are mimetic. Somebody on Facebook has been writing poems, and I like the poems. And so what do? I start writing poems. I hear French being spoken on the street. What do? I start speaking French to myself because I know how to speak French, but I never get a chance to. But when I hear it, it triggers something in me. It's mimesis. I think that humans have always perceived things that we're in awe of or that we are enchanted by. And what we do is we feel the need to imitate them in some way, whether it's to represent them on the walls of Lascaux, or whether it means we get dressed up in these large costumes. If you go to the Museum of Natural History in New York, you'll see in the Africa wing, you'll see these big spots. These medicine men would wear spots on their skin because they wanted to represent the leopard, or you'll see them wear these big shaggy straw costumes because they want to represent some demon of the forest. And I think that that's the origin of creativity. Creativity, in a way, is like what I said about the oyster and the pearl. Creativity is our way of connecting a mystery that we can't solve. The forces of nature, it's a way of almost accommodating those forces sometimes, talking to them, imploring them, and also sometimes trying to take inside of us to introject into ourselves those forces.
The creative process as a writer, the fact that you've been writing for so many years, the fact that you personally live your experiences to write your books, which is rather a method acting approach or method writing approach in terms of getting to the heart of a matter there. That doesn't always work for everyone though, but why has it worked for you specifically?
Oh God, if I could answer that question, why to me? I think that everybody is wired differently, Kurt. I mean, I've always been wired to want to know things firsthand. Now, that is not to say that I don't love researching things, but I did always feel that to really know something, to trust that I got it right, I would have to see it for myself. Missouri is the show me state, and I guess I'm the show me guy. I just like to know what I'm talking about. And I think that it's not just about being there and perceiving, because journalists go places and perceive things. It's about literally immersing yourself into something, feeling in a way that you have no life. It's not the guy who has the life jacket who's really going to write about swimming or swimming in the ocean. It's the one who doesn't. It's the one who's driven by desperation to really feel the thing, to feel what it's like. That's how has been for me. I've always felt that that's the thing I could trust. And, some of it is, who are your influences? When I was growing up, I just loved writers like Albert Camus, who was obviously writing from his own experience, even though he wasn't Meursault, the stranger. You could tell that he had thought about the problem of being Meursault. He had actually worked it out in his own mind. I always loved Henry Miller, because Henry Miller was like a guy sitting on the next stool at the bar, telling you, recounting his life, the life and times of. And I always liked that. I always liked the writer who could talk to you like he was really talking to you, that it was really his experience. And conversely, I don't like writers who take an attitude or a pose because it's an easy one to take. For instance, a writer who's going to write from a position of anger or criticism, just almost knee-jerk criticism, to me, that's weak. Why? Because any actor will tell you this. Anger is the easiest choice to make when you're playing a character. It's easy to be angry. It's easy to be angry and to be committed to that. And for some reason, we just fall. It's harder to be sensitive. It's harder to be vulnerable because those are nuances. Those are things you really have to feel. They're not things that you can glom onto because you've seen somebody be that way.
What exactly can you draw from your own experiences, and how does this question at this particular time dive into your psyche? So,
Music taught me a whole lot about not just about making music, but about how do you relate, what motivates people to go on a quest. What's the structure? The music business is a business, let's face it. And it's a business that is very bottom line, dollars and cents. What does it mean to be in an art form that's completely controlled by a business, where the people on top aren't really necessarily thinking like the people on the bottom? They're completely different. One group sees the other as a resource. So I learned a lot about indifference. I often think, writers I really loved when I was growing up was Franz Kafka, because you look at a Franz Kafka novel, there's no real nemesis, there's no devil. He doesn't have like a Hannibal Lecter in his book. With Franz Kafka, it's almost like there's the individual and an inscrutable universe where almost everybody is culpable. Anybody, the whole society is culpable. And in Rocked and Rolled, for instance, there is no one nemesis. There is no one producer, one evil A&R guy or record company executive who's putting the kibosh on all creativity or sucking dry all these wonderful talents. No, I feel that that's reductive and simplistic, and it's just not the way things are. If the system doesn't work, it's all of us who are part of that problem. If people are indifferent, if a friend comes up to the character Trevor and says, "Oh, by the way, sorry I missed your gig. When's your next gig?" Or, "Oh, I'm sorry I'm going to miss your gig. I'm seeing this other big band at Madison Square Garden." Whose fault is that? Who's the villain there? You know what I'm saying? It's like in one part of the book, Trevor goes out toward the end and he goes out to Los Angeles and he's staying with a woman who's seeing her favorite rock star do 10 different performances at the LA Forum when the LA Forum was still a big venue. But Trevor, he goes down to, I don't know, Madame Hong's or something, some place in Santa Monica down on Pico Boulevard. And he pays $3 and he goes in and sees like three different acts. And these are all like, these people who are, all have day jobs, probably cleaning people's houses or whatever. And then they're gunning on stage and they're all wound up and wasted and he's digging this scene because these are people who are making music the way birds sing. They're doing it because they have to do it. Almost nobody cares. Meanwhile, there's this woman he's staying with who's like spending hundreds and hundreds of dollars to see one guy do the same thing 10 times, the same show. And it just seems to me that that's kind of where we're at in America. Maybe that's where we are in the world. People, when it comes to entertainment and the arts, people will all talk about Leonardo da Vinci and Picasso and everything, but do they know the guy next door is painting in his living room, and do they ever care about that? Would they ever think that maybe what he was doing was worthwhile? I don't know.
That's the trouble with creativity nowadays, especially when it comes to the mass consumption and the extreme mass consumption of art and short form media. And I think that's the horrible aspect about mass consuming content where you don't really know what you are interested in. And so you're just given a plethora of everything, and hopefully you follow something that speaks to you, if it actually does speak to you. I went back to school for visual arts and film from an IT career of 20 years. So that's a huge shift from logic to creativity, where I had to learn how to do color wheels in the first day of art school, fine art school, I should say. You learn what speaks to you and what promotes yourself as a creative person. And we're all creative in some way, shape, or form, but whether or not we act upon that, I think is the most difficult aspect. And that's why I love talking with yourself and with other people that have been on the show for the past 16 years, because I know there's a burning creativity that they just want to get out there, and hopefully this is a good platform for it.
In my next book of essays, which will be coming out in a few months, called Culture Craze, I deal with some of the issues that you're actually mentioning. One of my essays is everyone creative? And I do believe what you're saying is absolutely true, Kurt. I think we're all creative. We're all mimetic and we're all creative. And it's just a matter of who lights the spark, how confident we feel about doing these things, where the creativity goes. I think that, for instance, when I came to New York, I knew I wanted to be a writer. But I think that when I came to New York, what it did to me, like if you look at a lot of the people who come to New York, they know specifically what they came to do. They know that they came to be in the rock scene, or they came to be in the folk scene, or they came to work with this person or that kind of or that artist. And with me, what happened when I came to New York was rather than come for one specific target, to do one specific thing, to work with one particular group, I found out that my interests diffused. I became more interested in music. I developed my own art form called plastiglass, which is a kind of collage where you use plastics and gels and glass to create stained glass that doesn't use lead. I got involved in journalism. I got involved in a lot of different and art criticism and a lot of topics and genres that I didn't really specifically come to New York to do. And I think that we live in an age where we venerate the Renaissance people who were interested in all kinds of things, but we really do reward the specialist, the person who just becomes more specializes to the extent that they're really talking about doing one very, very narrow thing. And I think to some extent that's a shame because I think it's a shame because I think that the wider your interests and the more things that you know about and the more things you like to do, all of those different interests can enrich the primary interest that you have. Everything informs everything else. So that if you know about music, it can help you write. If you know about writing, it can definitely help your music. If you know about art, it can also help your writing because it helps you see better. It helps you define things better. It helps you describe things better.
What's the most unconventional or counterintuitive life lesson you've learned from your journey as a writer?
Hmm, that's a good one. Here's one that comes to me. It's really on top of mind. So let me just give it to you because we don't have a whole lot of time for meditation and quiet thought. This little lesson has come to me from very disparate sources. My mother used to tell me, you've got to want it, but you can't need it. And then I met a record company executive who kind of told me the same thing. You got to want it, but you can't need it. And yet other people would tell you just the opposite, Kurt, that how much do you want? How much do you want it? How much do you want? Do you want it so bad? You have to want it so bad that you'll do anything for it. So you have these two conflicting ideas. I worked with a guitarist who even took the you got to want it but not need it to an extreme. He said to me, when you don't want it anymore, that's when you get it. And there's a point in Rocked and Rolled where Trevor says, the dream seemed to have, died at this one gig, but yet he kept on going. He kept on getting more gigs. It's almost like this music career was going. He was like a ride and he was on the ride. He was no longer in a way in control of it. If he had been writing his own script, he would have thought, oh, this is already gone. This is already over. And yet it wasn't over. And so I think that what's counterintuitive to what I would have thought is that what we see in ourselves, what we see as the thing that we do best, is not always what the world sees us doing best. What we think our greatest achievement is not what the world considers our best achievement. And somehow we have to keep on going and still make our own judgments, even though we have to always be aware that our judgments may, in the end, be peripheral or somewhat irrelevant. In other words, success and intention are not aligned. You intend one thing, but you could be successful for something entirely different.
Everyone has one person that inspired them on their path to where they are today. Who was that for you?
Oh God, this is just this is tough. This is really a difficult one because I would say that again, it's like the moment. What moment in your life was the most pivotal or meaningful? I would say there are several people. Let's start off in the writing realm. Perhaps my favorite writer when I was beginning to see myself as a writer, Francois Arouet. Voltaire. He was a writer who actually had to spend a year in the Bastille because he insulted a nobleman with a witty barb. He was a guy who wrote so many volumes, and yet the thing we all remember him for is probably the slimmest of them, Candide. He was a writer who could make me laugh, probably a little like almost 200 years after he wrote. So to me, that was a remarkable, I was very inspired by Voltaire as a writer. I was inspired by Kafka because Kafka kind of saw the world in a way that I began to see it, where it's just you, the individual, in an inscrutable universe. Nobody's telling you what's going on, and yet everything seems to be against you, and you have to keep on going. One agent once told me, as a matter of fact, he said, Eric, you write about the nebbish, the schlemiel, the little guy who's up against great odds in an inscrutable universe. So I said, well, that sounds really good. You want to be my agent? No, no, I don't think anybody's buying that. But that's what you. And so I'm very interested in that, and I think Kafka gave me kind of like inspired that in that model for me. I loved Henry Miller. I have to say, the person who changed my life probably the most, who put me on this path of being a writer, a teacher I met in Hebrew school, Mr. Raskin. He was a history teacher at a local high school. And he told me, Eric, you're a better writer than Philip Roth. You should become a writer. That's what you should do. And I was in ninth grade. I was 14, 15 years old. And on that basis, I became a writer. It's like that's when I started my apprenticeship as a writer. So I would say that he had a really profound effect on me. I think my wife has had a great effect on me because she opened up me up in a different, completely different way, but which ended up again helping my art, my writing, made me a little more of a compassionate person, somebody who could really understand somebody or feel somebody else's point of view. And my daughter has been incredibly inspirational to me. She's opened up areas of laughter, of self, she's made me more, amused about myself because, a child always sees you very differently than you see yourself. I've in developing her talents and seeing her talents and being able to perceive her growing up and shaping, helping, trying to help shape her. That was enormously inspirational and impactful to me as a human being.
From a professional standpoint, you are a multi-talented writer. You are a journalist, a poet. We touched on a brief spattering of what you're capable of doing when it comes to writing here. And I want to have you back on because there's so much more we can dive into and talk about that I want to touch on maybe in the next year for sure, because I want to pick your brain on so many different areas. So from a professional standpoint, you are successful. Do you consider yourself personally successful?
I would say that, I just wrote a poem called Two Brothers, The Two Brothers. I have a little bit, I've been thinking about this a lot, Kurt, from the standpoint of the good angel, the bad angel, self-doubt, self-affirmation, the existentialist, being always surpassing yourself and yet always falling short, how we're constrained by others and yet we always try to transcend. And I would say, I don't know, success. I would say yes, to some extent. I feel successful as a person in that I smile, I can laugh, I can feel love. I've felt these things. I've been able to experience things that, let's say, in my early 20s, late teens, I wasn't sure I'd be able to. Have I always succeeded at everything? No. I would say this, and I don't know maybe if this is going to impinge on any other question. For your listener or viewer who wants to do as you did very bravely, which is to say, to hell with this, to hell with my comfort zone. I know all about how to talk to machines. I know all about logic and math. And now I'm going to go off and become a creative person. How to start. And I would say the first thing to do, and this is going to be counterintuitive, and it's also going to sound like, oh, this is not what we're taught about teamwork and all the other things. I would say, to hell with what everybody else says. Turn off the other voices, turn off the other channels. People are jerks. They're never going to tell you the truth. It doesn't matter whether it's in a creative workshop where everybody's supposed to be constructive and be, very positive and supportive, or whether it's your mom or whether it's your friend. Most people are not going to be helpful when you are starting out. Think about it this way. Almost every religion that we know, whether it was Christianity or Judaism or Buddhism or Islam, what do the main characters have to do? They have to go off into the wilderness. Why? Well, for one thing, because they're innovators, and innovators usually are getting thrown out of civilization. But there's another factor here. They have to be able to hear their own voice. They have to be able to be by themselves and understand what it is that they have to do. They have to be able to hear that. And if you're listening to other people, if you're in a crowd, if you're with familiar people, they're all going to tell you, no, no, you just had a bad dream. Go back to the way you were. Be normal. And being an artist is not being normal. You are, in a way, emulating those innovators. You are being like Jesus or Moses or Muhammad or Siddhartha, the Buddha. You're doing like, because you are following your own vision. You are following your own path. And even when you get out there in the wilderness, what are you going to do? You're going to hear the howling of the wolves and the coyotes. You're going to hear the hiss and the susurrus movements of the snake. You're going to feel you're going to hear these voices in the wind that are filling you with doubt and fear. You have to deal with them and understand that that's the process of becoming a creative person. And it's worth it. but you have to get through it. If it were easy, everybody would do it, but you have to be able to do that. Don't listen to other people. Follow your own voice. Go out in your own wilderness. There's no alternative.
The reverse of success is failure. How do you deal with your failures?
Oh, well, I don't know if you ever really quote unquote deal with them. Again, you can cover them with the nacre of the oyster, you can try to make pearls out of them. I remember I wrote an essay in one of my books called All Over the Place, Essays from A to Z. This is it, if you want to look at it. Each essay begins with a different letter of the alphabet. The first one is called Agents of Despair, and it goes over my horrible interactions with agents. But they're comical. One agent, this elderly British lady who received 5 pages of my book and went, "It's not meaty enough. It's not meaty enough." And I go, "What do you mean it's not meaty enough? What do you mean it's not meaty enough?" And then she hangs up the phone. I call up about, and it tormented me. This prophetic, invocation. It's not meaty enough. And I called back about a month later, and this young woman answers. I say, "Can you get me this agent?" She told me this oracular thing. It's not meaty enough, and I want to know what she meant. And she said to me, "I'm sorry, she died." So now I've got this torment. Not only did this agent tell me it's not meaty enough, but now I'll never find out what she meant. Maybe these were her dying words, to this aspiring writer. I hope that gives you an idea of what failure can do to you. Rejection and failure. Yes, we fear these things, and almost the fear of them is almost as bad as the thing itself, believe me. Remember what Shakespeare said, in I believe it was Henry the Fourth, Part One. A soldier dies one, but a coward dies 1,000. But I'll tell you something. Even though you may fear failure, there is nothing like experiencing it. It's like the Jim Morrison song, "People Are Strange." Faces look ugly when you're alone. You can't look at people square in the face because you feel like you're ashamed. There's a shame that goes along with failure, especially in the United States, because we are taught in the United States that everybody can be a success. Oh, you just have to want it enough. You have to work hard enough, and if you work hard enough and you want it enough, you can have it. That's the American dream. And so, of course, when you're inculcated that kind of dogma, failure is like walking around without any skin. It's like you're stripped of your skin.
That's the first I've heard in 16 years. So there you go.
Oh, but you do grow more skin, luckily, like the snake.
That's where thick skin comes into play, I guess. Your experience there, it will dog many people. And same with words, same with expressions, same with people that you've interacted with for many years. Some cases it gets to the point of, why is this bothering me? And can I actually move on? And if we can, great. If not, then that's why psychologists still get paid hundreds of dollars an hour.
Luckily, there were times when I'd say to my wife, I want to chuck this. I can't stand this. Well, what's the point? Why am I spending hours and hours and days and years only so I can submit something to some agent who's going to go, "Not meaty enough"? He said, "No, quit. Stop." She would just do it just like that. Yeah. You don't want to do it? You're the one who's doing it. Stop doing it. And that's the whole thing. That's where existentialism comes in. If we turn off the engine, the car won't move. And it's the same with our creativity. If you don't want to do it, you don't have to do it. Can do something else. And I've taught that to my daughter too. I remember once we were driving along Sunset Boulevard and she was just in a funk. And she said, "Oh, I just, don't want to do," and she was, working the day job, not advancing as much as she wanted to, as fast as she wanted to. So I said to her, "Honey, you can follow my example. You don't have to be married to this. You don't have to, say, 'Oh, I have to go down this path because I've been going down it. I've been going down this path. If I stop, then I'll be ashamed and I don't know what I'm going to say to my parents. How could I have wasted my time?'" No, you don't have to ever worry about that. You always have permission. Give yourself permission to pick yourself up and do something else. And I do really believe that. I don't believe that anybody should ever feel that they have to do something. You do it because you want to do it. And I'm telling you, when my wife told me, "Get rid of it. Stop. Don't do it anymore," that was like a bucket of cold water. It couldn't have helped me more. And I think my daughter was also helped by the same advice. Freedom, always shown your freedom, is the best way to keep on going on your path.
The younger generation is looking at your work and they're becoming inspired to be creative in their own way, whether it's as a writer, a journalist, or something along the creative spectrum. Maybe you're inspiring them down their path. And the fact that you have the younger generation with your daughter, maybe you've inspired her down a creative path in some way, shape, or form. How can they inspire the generation that follows them?
Excellent question. When I was teaching, there are different models of teaching. One of them is I teach what I know. Another one is I teach what I do. In other words, the guy who goes in and, he's an advertising dude and he goes in there and he teaches you advertising because he does it. And you're inspired because, hey, here's a living example of a creative director and he's made it. So if I listen to him, I'll learn. But there's also the person who teaches what I am. Teach what you are. If you walk through life teaching people what you are, that probably is the greatest incentive because they realize that the next generation and the generation after that, there'll be different techniques, there'll be different media, there'll be different genres. Those things change, they revert, things go in and out of style. But what is always there, what is always most meaningful is the person themselves. Ecce homo, here I am. Here I am. This is who I am. This is what it is to be a creative person. This is how the creative person thinks. This is how the creative person behaves. This is the orientation. And I think that that's what I would tell to my daughter, her generation, the millennials, the Zs, and the alphas, the omegas, whoever's coming after them. Teach who you are. Be the example. Be the light. Don't just shine the light, but be the light.
If your life was a book, what would its title be? And what would its soundtrack be?
That's good because my daughter was always telling me I should go back and write my autobiography. And I keep on telling her my autobiography is like a mosaic of all the books, all the novels and essays that I've written. And if you scattered them on the floor, you have a jigsaw puzzle, you have to put them back together. But I would say that when I was thinking about writing my autobiography, I had a few different ones. One of them was Void Where Prohibited. Used to see that on different cans and soft drink containers. In other words, this offer, or you'd see it on coupons, void where prohibited, means where you can't use it. It has no value if somebody's not going to let you use it. And I feel that's one of my titles because I feel that for me, it wasn't a question of knowing what my mission, what my vocation was. I always knew I was going to be a creative person. I always knew I was going to be a writer, but it was, will people let me do it? Well, I mean, if the tree falls in Siberia, does anyone hear it? If the writer is writing and when I used to go to parties as a young man in New York, I'd say, I'm a writer. So, oh, what have you published? What have you written? Oh, where have you written it? I mean, it's always about the context. Yes, you do the text, but do you have a context for that text? And I feel that Void Were Prohibited would be a good title for me. I have a CD of my 12 recorded songs. It might be that. It could be, I don't want to be too pretentious. And of course, Stanley Kubrick already appropriated, but Thus Spake Zarathustra, Schubert's Unfinished Symphony. I always love the fact that it just sort of like ends. It ends on like this little note, and that's how it ends. I love Robert Schumann's Scenes from Childhood. Of course, Judy Davis's movie, My Brilliant Career, appropriated that. There's so many. You ask questions for me. I'm like one of these people who can't. I love so many different kinds of music. I can't really say, oh, I like Eric Satie. I love Ravel's Tombeau de Couperin. But I would say maybe I should just stick with my own songs because those really reflect me.
What was the name of your band? Because I never got to ask that.
Oh, yeah, it was called the Erotics. Somebody somebody had the idea that it would be a very neat marketing twist. I think it was my girlfriend at the time, because I could always put a big poster with the erotics want you to come, and put where the club. And then so that's what we did. In my book, I changed all of that because obviously the erotics makes it sound like it could be a live sex act. So that if you're not, getting pulling down your pants and masturbating on stage, people will feel like they didn't get their $3 worth. But anyway, so but But when you're young, you don't think of every angle, right? So.
It was a good play on words, have to admit. Well done there. Unfortunately, that ends this particular episode of Two Geeks Talking. I want to thank you so much, Eric, for coming on the show.
Thank you, Kurt. It's been a real pleasure. I've loved this ranging conversation.
It truly has been a blast. I can't wait to have you back on. But for those that want to find you online, where can we find you? How can we support you? Or anything else you would like to promote?
That the best place to look is Eric Sonnenschein on Amazon.com. If you do that, you'll find all my books. You'll find my author page with the 10 books. I've written one book of poetry, 4 volumes of essays, and 5 novels. And then, of course, you can find me on ericsonnenschein.com. In fact, somebody just did. I got an email from somebody I hadn't spoken to in a long time, found me on my website. ericsonnenschein.com, really good place, a very easy website to look at. You can also find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on Facebook and X, and it's always Eric Sonnenschein. I'm right there. So please, I've written, with no exaggeration, 240 essays on LinkedIn. Anybody can access them, and it's all free. You can go on Amazon.com. You can sample any one of my books. Please do. And the latest one, Rocked and Rolled, if you're interested in that sort of thing, creativity, music business, suffering, starvation, all those.
Well, like I said, that ends this particular episode of Two Geeks Talk. You can, of course, find this interview and 1,200 plus others on our website, which is going through a revamp. So go to our YouTube channel. That will have everything. YouTube.com/TGT Media. That's Two Geeks Talking. That's TWO. Not the number 2. That's a completely different website you don't want to go to. Similar to the Erotics. It's very ironic how the internet works these days. Exactly, yeah. So you can, of course, find the podcast by searching Two Geeks Talking wherever you get your podcasts. And as I say every week, everyone has a story to tell. It's up to me to help bring that out. Thanks for listening and watching on Two Geeks Talking.
Thanks, Kurt. You're a master. Look forward to talking to you again.
I appreciate that, yeah.